Two black twins stand in front of a judge, their voices shaking as they beg for help. But what they say next breaks the courtroom and the judge, wide open. As their father faces life in prison, a hidden truth comes to light, one that was never meant to be found. Why did the judge suddenly break into tears? And how far will he go to fight a system that wants him silent? This is a story of family, justice, and one final decision that could cost everything, or save it all. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evidence room hummed with the quiet whir of computers and fluorescent lights. Judge William Hart stood behind Marissa King's chair, his normally stern expression softened by concentration as they watched the convenience store security footage play across her monitor. His fingers tapped lightly against the back of her chair, betraying the tension he fought to contain. "Let's start from the beginning," Marissa said, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard. She was young but experienced, with sharp eyes that missed nothing when it came to digital evidence. Her dark ponytail swung slightly as she leaned forward. "This is the full file from the night of Mr. Cole's arrest." The grainy black and white footage showed the empty store. The timestamp in the corner ticked forward steadily. 11:42 p.m., 11:43 p.m. The convenience store looked peaceful, almost boring with its neat rows of shelves and single sleepy cashier behind the counter. Shadows gathered in the corners where the security camera couldn't quite reach. At 11:44 p.m., a tall, thin figure entered the frame. Jeremiah Cole moved slowly, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Hart leaned closer, studying the man's movements. There was nothing threatening about him, just exhaustion etched into every step. "Watch the timestamp," Marissa instructed, pointing to the numbers. Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if sharing a secret. "Right. Here." The scene jumped. Hart blinked, then frowned. "Play that again." Marissa rewound the footage. This time, Hart kept his eyes fixed on the timestamp. 11:47 p.m. suddenly became 11:53 p.m. 6 minutes vanished in the blink of an eye. 6 minutes that could mean everything for a man's freedom. "That's not normal wear and tear on old footage," Marissa explained, her voice taking on a professional edge. "See how clean the cut is? No static, no distortion. That's not just a glitch, that's a manual edit." She tapped her pen against the screen, circling the area where the time jumped. Hart's jaw tightened. "Can you verify when this file was last accessed?" "Already on it." Marissa opened another window displaying lines of technical data. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. The original upload was at 2:13 a.m. the night of the arrest, but there's one more access timestamp. She highlighted a line of text. "Officer James Reeves, 3 days later." "The arresting officer," Hart said quietly. His mind was already racing through the implications. Years of maintaining a poker face in court served him well now, but inside, his heart was pounding. Tampered evidence, that changes everything. He straightened up, feeling a strange mixture of anger and hope. Marissa nodded grimly. "Want me to print everything?" "Yes, the full metadata report, access logs, and screenshots showing the timestamp discrepancy. I need it all officially documented and signed." Hart began pacing the small space behind her desk, his footsteps measured and deliberate. While Marissa gathered the evidence, Hart pulled out his phone and stepped away from her desk. He dialed Cynthia Morales' number, keeping his voice low, aware of other technicians working nearby. "Cynthia, we need to talk. I've found something significant regarding the Cole case." He heard paper shuffling on the other end. "What kind of significant?" "The kind that could change the entire outcome. The security footage was edited after the arrest. We have proof." He couldn't keep the edge of triumph from his voice. There was a moment of stunned silence, then, "Oh my God." Her voice trembled slightly. That's exactly what we needed. Have you documented everything?" "Doing it now. I'm scheduling an evidentiary hearing 2 days from now." Hart glanced at his watch, mentally rearranging his calendar. "I'll clear my calendar," Cynthia said quickly. The relief in her voice was palpable. "Thank you, William. I knew something wasn't right about this case." "We're not done yet," Hart reminded her. But yes, this changes things considerably. After hanging up, Hart composed a formal memo to Michael Lansing. His fingers moved deliberately across his phone's keyboard, each word carefully chosen. To District Attorney Michael Lansing. State versus Cole. An evidentiary hearing has been scheduled for Thursday 9 a.m. regarding newly discovered irregularities in the security footage evidence. Your presence is required. Judge William Hart. He hit send, then turned back to Marissa, who was now organizing a stack of printed documents. The printer hummed in the background, spitting out page after page of damning evidence. Everything's here, she said, handing him a thick folder. I've signed and dated all the relevant pages. The timestamps are highlighted, and I've included still frames showing the jump cut in the footage. Her eyes met his, understanding the gravity of what they'd found. Thank you, Marissa. This stays between us for now. He gripped the folder tightly, as if afraid it might disappear. She nodded seriously. Of course, Your Honor. Hart moved to his office, where his assistant was already waiting with the court calendar. Together, they cleared Thursday's morning schedule, moving or postponing other cases to make room for the evidentiary hearing. Each case moved was another person waiting for justice, but Hart knew this couldn't wait. Before leaving, Hart returned to the evidence room one last time. Marissa had stepped out, but her computer was still running the footage. He watched as Jeremiah Cole appeared on screen again, his movements slow and careful. The man's face was gaunt, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. He walked toward the store counter with the hesitant steps of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Then the screen jumped and 6 minutes of truth vanished into digital darkness. Hart reached out and shut off the monitor. Now we fight, he said quietly, his words barely a whisper in the empty room. The promise felt like a vow. The evidence folder felt heavy in his hands, not from its physical weight, but from the weight of what it represented. Justice delayed was justice denied, but perhaps it wasn't too late to set things right. Hart straightened his shoulders and walked out, leaving the darkened evidence room behind him. For the first time in weeks, his steps carried purpose and hope. Judge William Hart sat in his chambers, the morning light filtering through tall windows and casting long shadows across his polished desk. The security footage evidence lay before him in a neat manila folder, each page carefully arranged. His fingers drummed against the leather armrest of his chair as he reached for his phone. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like a physical burden. Sandra, he spoke to his assistant through the intercom, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Please ask Michael Lansing to join me for a brief procedural update on the Cole case. Yes, Your Honor, I'll notify him right away. While waiting, Hart reviewed the documents one final time. The metadata printouts, access logs, and time-stamped records formed an undeniable pattern. Each piece of evidence had been meticulously authenticated by Marissa King, her signature clear and professional at the bottom of each page. His stomach tightened as he traced the timeline of tampering with his index finger. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, Hart called out, straightening in his chair and composing his expression into judicial neutrality. Michael Lansing strode into the chamber with his characteristic confidence, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His tailored suit and perfect posture projected the image of a man completely at ease with his authority. Judge Hart, what's so urgent it couldn't wait until tomorrow's status hearing? Have a seat, Michael. Hart gestured to the chair across from his desk, keeping his tone measured. Something's come to my attention that requires immediate discussion. Lansing settled into the chair, his posture relaxed and assured. Of course, though I hope this won't take long. I have a meeting with the DA in 30 minutes. He checked his watch with a casual flick of his wrist. Hart met Lansing's gaze steadily. I've just finished reviewing the security footage from Mr. Cole's arrest. He paused, watching Lansing's face carefully. The original footage. Something flickered behind Lansing's eyes, but his smile remained fixed. I'm not sure I follow. We've all seen the footage. His voice remained smooth, but Hart caught the slight tensing of his shoulders. Not all of it, Hart said quietly. He opened the manila folder and began laying out documents one by one. What we saw in court was missing approximately 6 minutes of footage. The metadata shows the file was accessed and modified after the initial upload, specifically by the arresting officer. The smile on Lansing's face wavered slightly as his eyes darted between the papers being arranged before him. Hart continued methodically placing evidence across his desk. Timestamp comparisons, access logs, authentication certificates. The quiet rustling of paper filled the tense silence between them. "This is the original metadata," Hart said, sliding one particular document forward. "And this is the access log showing when and by whom the file was modified." His finger tapped deliberately on the highlighted name and timestamp. Lansing leaned forward, his casual demeanor cracking. He picked up one of the papers, scanning it quickly. "This appears to be some sort of technical irregularity," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "A minor glitch in the system, perhaps. These things happen with digital evidence." "A glitch doesn't selectively remove 6 minutes of footage," Hart replied evenly. "A glitch doesn't leave behind an access signature. This was a deliberate edit, Michael." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to dismiss. Lansing set the paper down, his jaw tightening. Even if there was some discrepancy with the footage, it doesn't change the fundamental facts of the case. Cole was caught stealing. The missing minutes don't alter that reality. His fingers smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his tie. Hart leaned forward in his chair. "This could constitute suppression of exculpatory evidence. You understand the implications." He let the gravity of those words sink in, watching as Lansing's confidence visibly faltered. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Lansing's voice took on an edge. "Whether there's missing footage or not, Jeremiah Cole still committed theft. The edits, if they exist, don't change that basic truth." A flush of color crept up his neck. "But it changes why he stole," Hart countered, his voice firm but measured. "And whether this trial was fair, the integrity of our entire process is at stake here." Hart tapped his pen against the desk for emphasis, the soft clicking punctuating his words. Lansing's fingers drummed against his knee. "The evidence of his guilt is still overwhelming. This technical issue doesn't—" "I'm scheduling an evidentiary hearing for Wednesday morning," Hart interrupted, his tone making it clear this wasn't up for discussion. "All parties will be present, including the arresting officer. This matter requires full scrutiny, Michael." He reached for his calendar and made a notation, the scratch of his pen loud in the tense room. "You're making a mistake," Lansing said, his voice low. "This will only complicate a straightforward case. The department won't appreciate having their methods questioned." Perhaps that's exactly what this case needs. Complications that lead to truth. Hart gathered the documents back into the folder. "I suggest you prepare thoroughly for Wednesday. This hearing will examine every aspect of how this evidence was handled." He closed the folder with a soft but definitive thud. Lansing stood abruptly, his face now a mask of stone. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the door, his shoulders rigid with tension. His footsteps echoed sharply across the hardwood floor. Hart watched him go, waiting until the door closed firmly behind him. The chamber felt heavier in the silence that followed. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the morning's confrontation settle over him like a physical burden. His hand reached for a worn copy of People v. Sloan that sat on the corner of his desk, its pages marked with years of reference, dog-eared and familiar as an old friend. As he flipped through the familiar pages, a particular paragraph caught his eye. Taking up his yellow highlighter, Hart drew a careful line beneath the words, "Justice is not blind. It is often bound by the courage of those who wield it." His hand trembled slightly as he recapped the marker, wondering if he had found his own courage at last. The courtroom buzzed with tension on Wednesday morning. Reporters packed the gallery, their notebooks ready and pens poised. The air felt heavy with anticipation, making even whispers seem loud in the charged atmosphere. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden floors and illuminating dust particles that danced in the beams like tiny, nervous fireflies. Naomi and Nadine Cole sat close together in the front row beside Cynthia Morales. The twins wore matching blue dresses, their best clothes, though the fabric showed signs of wear at the hems and elbows. Nadine's fingers were intertwined tightly with her sister's, her knuckles white from the pressure. her eyes wide and anxious as they waited. Every few seconds, she would glance toward the side door, then back to her sister for reassurance. The side door opened with a heavy creak that silenced the murmurs throughout the room. Two officers led Jeremiah Cole into the courtroom, the chains around his wrists and ankles clinking with each careful step, a harsh metallic soundtrack to his entrance. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his thin frame, emphasizing how much weight he'd lost during his time in custody, and dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises. But when he caught sight of his daughters, a spark of hope flickered across his tired face, momentarily erasing the exhaustion etched there. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice booming across the room. "The Honorable Judge William Hart presiding." Judge Hart entered with measured steps, his black robe settling around him as he took his seat. His expression was granite steady, revealing nothing as he surveyed the packed courtroom, his eyes taking in every face before him with practiced neutrality. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying clear authority without needing to raise it. "We're here today for an evidentiary hearing in the matter of State versus Jeremiah Cole. Mr. Lansing, you may call your first witness." Michael Lansing rose smoothly from behind the prosecution table, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. "The state calls Darren Bowles." A man in his early 30s approached the witness stand. His brown hair was uncombed, sticking up at odd angles, and his wrinkled polo shirt had seen better days, with a small stain near the collar. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair with a hint of nervous energy, his right leg bouncing slightly. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Lansing began, standing tall and confident. "Darren Bowles. I used to work at Miller's convenience store up until about 6 months ago." His voice carried a slight tremor, despite his attempt to sound assured. "And in what capacity did you work there?" "I was a clerk. Worked the register mostly, stocked shelves, that kind of thing. Opening and closing too, sometimes." Lansing nodded, pacing slowly across the front of the courtroom like an actor on stage. "During your time there, did you become familiar with the defendant, Jeremiah Cole?" "Oh yeah," Darren said, jerking his chin toward Jeremiah. "That man's been stealing from that store for years. We just didn't catch him before. Always had a feeling about him." In the front row, Naomi stiffened as if she'd been struck. Her whisper was barely audible. "He's lying." Nadine squeezed her hand harder, her own face pale but determined as she nodded in agreement, a silent pact between sisters. "Can you elaborate on what you observed?" Lansing pressed, leaning slightly toward the witness. "Sure. He'd come in real quiet like, always when it was busy, slip stuff in his pockets when he thought no one was looking." Darren's eyes darted around the courtroom, never quite settling on any one spot, flicking from floor to ceiling to walls but avoiding direct contact with anyone. Judge Hart watched the witness carefully, noting how the man's gaze skipped past Jeremiah entirely, as if the defendant were invisible in his own hearing. "Thank you, Mr. Bowles." Lansing turned to the bench with a satisfied nod. "Nothing further, Your Honor." "Ms. Morales," Hart said, "your witness." Cynthia stood, adjusting her glasses with one finger pushed against the bridge. "Mr. Bowles, you said you worked at Miller's until 6 months ago. Why did your employment end?" Darren shifted in his seat, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. "Just wasn't working out. You know how it goes." "Were you fired?" Her question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. "Objection," Lansing called out, rising quickly to his feet. "Relevance." "Goes to credibility, Your Honor." Cynthia responded without missing a beat. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Hart's tone left no room for argument. Darren's jaw tightened, a muscle visibly twitching near his temple. "Yeah, I was fired." "For what reason?" "They said there were discrepancies in the register counts during my shifts." He scratched at his neck, a flush creeping up from his collar. Cynthia nodded slowly, letting the moment stretch. "So you were terminated for theft?" "Objection." Lansing stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sustained," Hart ruled. "Move on, Ms. Morales." "Mr. Bowles, you testified that Mr. Cole had been stealing for years. Do you have any documentation of these alleged thefts? Her voice remained calm but insistent. Well, no, but... His words trailed off uncertainly. Did you ever file a police report? No, He tried to continue but was cut off again. Did you ever inform your manager about these supposed incidents? Darren's confidence was cracking like thin ice. Look, we all knew... Yes or no, Mr. Bowles? Did you ever officially report any of these alleged thefts? Cynthia's patience was firm but wearing thin. No, he muttered, looking down at his hands. In fact, Cynthia continued, taking a step closer to the witness stand, isn't it true that there are no records whatsoever of Mr. Cole stealing from Miller's prior to this current charge? I guess not, but he fidgeted with the button on his cuff. Your Honor, Cynthia turned to the bench. I move to strike this testimony due to lack of corroborating records. Judge Hart considered for a moment, his fingers steepled before his face. Motion denied for now, but the court notes your objection. The rest of the day's testimony continued, witness after witness, but Jeremiah sat quietly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the proceedings, only occasionally glancing toward his daughters with eyes full of unspoken apologies. When the bailiff finally called for adjournment, he leaned close to Cynthia. I've never seen that man before in my life, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion and disbelief. Not once. As the officers approached to escort Jeremiah back to custody, Naomi couldn't hold back any longer. She crumpled forward, deep sobs racking her small frame, the sound heartbreaking in its rawness. Nadine wrapped her arms around her sister, their tears mixing together as they clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. From the bench, Judge Hart watched the scene unfold. His hand tightened around the smooth wood of his gavel until his knuckles turned white, but he remained silent, his face a mask of judicial restraint, even as the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon his shoulders. Something flickered behind his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or memory, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. The evening sun had long since disappeared behind thick storm clouds as Judge William Hart sat alone in his chambers. Rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to his focused investigation. His desk lamp cast a warm glow over scattered papers and his computer screen, where he methodically pulled up city employment records. Something wasn't right about that testimony, he muttered, fingers moving swiftly across his keyboard as he searched for information on Darren Bowles. The witness's shifty demeanor during cross-examination had raised red flags Hart couldn't ignore. The way Bowles had avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in his voice when pressed for details, all of it had triggered Hart's finely tuned instincts. He started with the basics, employment history at the convenience store. His eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the records, making careful notes on a legal pad beside him. Thunder rumbled outside as he cross-referenced the dates with store employment logs, the sound echoing his growing suspicion. Wait a minute, Hart said softly, leaning closer to the screen. He double-checked the dates, then checked them again, his heartbeat quickening. According to the official records, Darren Bowles' employment at the store had ended 8 months before Jeremiah's alleged theft. Hart's jaw tightened as he dug deeper, the implications of this discrepancy sending a jolt through him. The judge's search expanded to criminal records next. Years of experience had taught him to leave no stone unturned. As he scrolled through the database, another troubling detail emerged: a prior arrest for filing a false police report. Though the case was never prosecuted, the incident report painted a clear picture of someone with a questionable relationship with the truth. Hart felt a knot forming in his stomach. There's more here, Hart muttered, returning to the employment records. He found a formal complaint filed by a store manager during Bowles' employment. His eyes widened as he read the details. Documented incidents of racially discriminatory remarks made toward customers and fellow employees. The complaint had been one of the factors leading to Bowles' termination. Hart's fingers tightened around his pen, leaving indentations on the paper. Hart sat back in his chair, running a hand over his tired face. The rain continued its steady pattern against the windows as he reached for his phone. He needed to act on this information quickly but carefully. Justice delayed was justice denied, and Jeremiah Cole had already waited too long. He dialed Eli's number first. Eli? "I need a favor," Hart said when his brother answered. "I need written affidavits from the convenience store's management. Tonight." "Yes, I know it's late, but this can't wait until morning." He heard the urgency in his own voice, unusual for a man who prided himself on calm control. After finishing with Eli, Hart composed a carefully worded message to Cynthia Morales. He knew he had to maintain proper judicial distance while ensuring justice was served. "Check Bowles' employment timeline," he wrote, keeping it simple but pointed. His finger hovered over the send button for just a moment before pressing it decisively. The judge spent the next hour and a half reviewing other aspects of the case, the storm outside growing more intense. The wind had picked up, making the windows rattle occasionally. But Hart barely noticed, absorbed in his work until his phone rang, cutting through his concentration like a knife. "Judge Hart," he answered, recognizing Cynthia's number. He wasn't even working there when it happened. Cynthia's voice crackled with excitement. "We can impeach him. His entire testimony falls apart." "I see," Hart replied, maintaining his judicial composure despite his internal satisfaction. "Thank you for the update, Ms. Morales." Inside, though, he felt a surge of vindication that warmed him more than the desk lamp's glow. After hanging up, Hart turned to his case notes. Under the warm lamplight, he wrote in clear, decisive strokes, "Key witness equals fabricated testimony." He underlined it twice, the significance of these words weighing heavily in the quiet chamber. Each stroke of his pen felt like a step toward righting a terrible wrong. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a loud crack of thunder that seemed to shake the building. Hart leaned back in his chair and released a long, slow breath. The storm outside had reached its peak, rain now pounding against the windows with fierce intensity. But inside his chambers, despite the chaos of the weather, Hart felt a profound sense of clarity. "We're close," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Outside, the wind howled and rain lashed against the windows with renewed vigor. But inside, in the warm light of his chamber, the first stirrings of justice had begun to take shape. The storm raged harder, its fury matching the intensity of Hart's determination. Water streamed down the windows in sheets, distorting the view of the city beyond. But inside his chambers, surrounded by the evidence of truth slowly coming to light, Hart remained focused and resolute. The path to justice, though challenging, was becoming clearer with each new revelation. The documents spread across his desk told a story, not just of Darren Bowles' deception, but of a system that needed correction. Each piece of evidence, each inconsistency uncovered, represented another step towards setting things right. The weight of this responsibility settled over Hart like a familiar cloak, one he'd worn for many years on the bench, though rarely had it felt this personal, this vital. Lightning illuminated his chambers again, casting dramatic shadows across the walls. The brief flash caught the reflection of his face in the window, tired but determined, showing the marks of a man who understood that true justice required more than just following the letter of the law. It required vigilance, dedication, and sometimes the courage to dig deeper when things didn't add up. A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, but Hart remained steady at his desk, his posture straight, his resolve unwavering. Inside, while the storm raged with uncontrolled fury, a sense of justice had begun to stir, quiet but powerful like the first rays of sun after a long night. For the first time since the trial began, Hart felt something close to hope for Jeremiah Cole's future. The storm followed Judge William Hart home, pelting his car with heavy drops as he pulled into his driveway. By the time he reached his front door, his suit was soaked through, water dripping from his silver hair onto his already dampened shoulders. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting long shadows across the wet walkway, and the door opened before he could reach for his keys. Claire stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, her reading glasses perched on top of her head where they'd been forgotten hours ago. The smell of a meal long gone cold wafted from the dining room behind her, mingling with the fresh scent of rain. "You missed dinner," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "Again." Hart shrugged off his wet jacket, hanging it carefully on the coat rack where it dripped onto the entryway tile. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The case, Dash." "The case," Claire echoed, following him into the dining room where plates of untouched food sat on the table under the soft glow of the chandelier. "It's always the case lately." From upstairs came the faint thump of bass music vibrating through the ceiling. Their daughter Isabel was in her room, probably with her headphones on full blast as usual. Hart glanced up at the ceiling, then back at his wife, noticing the tiny lines of worry that hadn't been there a month ago. "I'll heat this up," Claire said, reaching for his plate. But Hart gently caught her wrist, his fingers cool against her warm skin. "Claire," he said softly, "we need to talk." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. They sat down at the dining room table, the cold food forgotten between them. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, nature's own nervous heartbeat. "You've been distant for days, Will," Claire said, reaching across to touch his hand. "What's going on? You barely look at me anymore." Hart stared at their joined hands, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. The weight of everything he'd discovered, everything he was considering, pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible burden. He began, choosing his words carefully. "I'm reconsidering a mandatory sentence, one that could have serious consequences." Claire's hand tightened on his. "What kind of consequences?" "If I'm wrong about this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it could cost me everything. My position, my reputation, the career I've built over 30 years. "You're risking your career?" Claire's voice rose slightly, her eyes widening with alarm. A small crease appeared between her brows. Hart met her gaze steadily. "I'm risking someone else's life." The words hung heavy in the air between them, almost visible in their weight. From the stairwell came a slight creak of wood, but neither of them noticed, too absorbed in the moment's gravity. Claire leaned back in her chair, processing his words. "This isn't like you, Will. You've always believed in following the letter of the law. You've built your reputation on it." "Maybe that's been the problem," he replied, running a hand through his damp hair. "Maybe sometimes the letter of the law isn't enough. Maybe justice needs something more human." They sat in silence for a while, the rain providing a steady backdrop to their thoughts. Finally, Claire stood up and walked around the table to him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. He could smell her familiar lavender lotion, comforting in its constancy. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "I'm here. I've always been here." Later that evening, as Hart was heading upstairs to change out of his wet clothes, Isabel appeared in her doorway. She'd removed her headphones, and her dark eyes, so much like his own, studied him carefully. At 16, she noticed more than she let on. "Dad?" she said hesitantly. "Are you okay?" Hart paused on the stairs, looking at his teenage daughter. Her concern touched something deep inside him, reminding him of why this case meant so much. In her face, he saw the same innocence that had been stolen from so many. "I'm trying to be," he answered simply. After Claire had gone to bed, Hart found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic. The old wooden steps creaked under his weight as he made his way up, flashlight beam bouncing off dust motes in the air. In the corner, behind some old Christmas decorations and a forgotten bicycle pump, sat a cardboard box labeled "Family Photos" in his mother's neat handwriting. He pulled it closer, sitting cross-legged on the attic floor. The album he wanted was at the bottom. Dark blue leather, worn at the corners from years of handling, then years of neglect. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, the spine cracking in protest. The photos inside told a story he'd tried to forget. Birthday parties, family picnics, normal moments from a normal life, until they weren't. Near the back, he found what he was looking for. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. In the grainy photo, a man in handcuffs was being led down courthouse steps. His father's face was turned away from the camera, but Hart remembered that day with perfect clarity. The shame, the helplessness, the injustice. He closed the album carefully and descended the attic stairs. In his study, The old landline phone sat on his desk, the one piece of technology he'd never upgraded. His fingers moved automatically, dialing a number he hadn't called in over a decade but had never forgotten. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hart's heart pounded in his chest. On the 4th ring, there was a click. "Yeah?" The voice was gruff, familiar despite the years. Hart's own voice shook as he spoke. "Marcus, it's me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then his brother's voice, softer now. "Took you long enough." The neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window of Joe's diner, casting a red glow that mixed with the pale morning light. Judge William Hart sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the entrance. His brother's beaten-up pickup truck was already parked outside, right where Marcus said it would be. The sight of it made Hart's stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Hart checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightening his tie out of habit. He hadn't dressed for court today, opting instead for a simple navy suit without his usual formal touches. Still, next to Marcus's likely work clothes, he knew he'd look every bit the uptight judge his brother probably thought he was. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, noticing the tired lines around his eyes that seemed deeper this morning. The bell above the door chimed as Hart stepped inside. The diner smelled of coffee and bacon, nearly empty except for a couple of early morning regulars hunched over their newspapers. Marcus sat in a corner booth, his broad shoulders curved forward, strong hands wrapped around a white coffee mug. 15 years had turned his dark hair mostly gray, and deep lines creased the corners of his eyes. A lifetime of hard work was etched into every feature of his face. Marcus didn't look up as Hart approached, but his shoulders tensed. Hart cleared his throat. "Marcus." His brother gestured to the opposite seat with a slight nod. Hart slid into the booth, the vinyl cushion squeaking beneath him. A waitress appeared immediately, coffee pot in hand, her friendly smile a stark contrast to the tension between the brothers. "Coffee, hun?" she asked, already tipping the pot toward his empty mug. "Please," Hart said quietly, watching the dark liquid swirl. Steam rose between the brothers like a fragile barrier, dancing in the space that 15 years of silence had created. The silence stretched until Marcus finally spoke, his voice rougher than Hart remembered. "Didn't expect to hear from you. Ever, really." "I know." Hart stirred his coffee, though he hadn't added any cream or sugar. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, too loud in the quiet diner. "Thank you for coming." Marcus's laugh was short and bitter. 15 years of nothing, then a late-night phone call, and suddenly we're having breakfast? Must be something big, Will. Hart flinched at the use of his first name. In court, it was always Your Honor or Judge Hart. The formality was a comfort, a shield. Here, with his brother's sharp eyes on him, he felt exposed, stripped of the authority that had become his armor. "Do you remember that day?" Marcus asked suddenly, setting his mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. "When they took Dad?" Hart's hand tightened around his spoon. "Of course I remember." The memory flashed in his mind. Police officers in their living room, his father's confused face, his mother's tears. "You were what, 17? I was 12, watching them put those cuffs on him." Marcus shook his head. "But you know what I remember most? The way you changed after. It was like watching a door slam shut, like your heart turned to stone." The words hit Hart like a physical blow. He forced himself to meet his brother's gaze. "I thought if I was strong enough, I'd never feel that pain again." "Strong?" Marcus scoffed. "You ran away to law school and never looked back, left me and Mom to pick up the pieces." "I thought I could fix it," Hart said quietly. "If I understood the law well enough, if I worked hard enough, I could make sure what happened to Dad never happened to anyone else." "How'd that work out?" Marcus's voice was sharp, but there was something else there too. A hint of the little brother who used to look up to him, who once believed his big brother could fix anything. Hart stared into his coffee. "Not like I planned. The system, it's more complicated than I thought. Sometimes doing what's legal isn't the same as doing what's right." "Finally figured that out, did you?" Marcus's words were harsh, but his eyes held a glimmer of hope. "There's a case," Hart said slowly. "A man who stole food for his sick daughter. The evidence is tampered with, the witness is lying, but the law says I have to give him 20 years. Marcus leaned forward. "Just like Dad." "Just like Dad," Hart echoed. "Except this time, I'm the one in the robe. I'm the one with the power to destroy his life." "Then maybe you're the only one who can stop it," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "Maybe that's why you became a judge in the first place." Hart looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time in 15 years. Marcus's hands were rough from manual labor, grease permanently embedded under his nails. But his eyes were kind, like their father's had been. In them, Hart saw the reflection of the man he once wanted to become. "I could lose everything," Hart admitted. "My position, my reputation." "But you'd keep your soul," Marcus replied. "That's worth something." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history between them. Finally, Hart stood, pulling out his wallet to leave money for the coffee. Marcus stood too, his height matching Hart's. "Don't become the man who hurt us, Will," he said quietly. "Be the one we needed." Hart nodded and walked out into the morning sun, his heart heavier but clearer. Behind him, the diner's bell chimed one final time, a sound that felt strangely like hope. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Superior Court building, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge William Hart's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as he approached Chief Judge Ellison's chambers. His morning conversation with Marcus still rang in his ears, but now another challenge loomed ahead, one that might define the remainder of his career. The summons had arrived by courier just an hour ago, a crisp white envelope marked "Urgent" in bold red letters. Hart hadn't needed to guess why. News traveled fast in legal circles, especially bad news, and his recent actions regarding the Cole case hadn't gone unnoticed by those in power. Hart paused outside the heavy oak door, straightening his tie and taking a deep breath to steady himself. The brass nameplate gleamed in the hallway light. Chief Judge Robert Ellison. He knocked firmly, 3 precise taps. "Enter," came the clipped response from within. Chief Judge Ellison's chambers were a testament to power and tradition. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, adorned with framed newspaper clippings and photographs of Ellison with various politicians and dignitaries. Law books filled built-in shelves, their leather spines perfectly aligned. The man himself sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression stern beneath wire-rimmed glasses. "William," Ellison said, not rising or extending his hand. "Have a seat." Hart settled into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. The leather creaked softly beneath him, betraying its age and quality. On Ellison's desk, Hart noticed a familiar case file, Jeremiah's file, positioned deliberately at the center like an exhibit in a trial. Ellison removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a monogrammed cloth. The gesture seemed calculated to build tension, a courtroom trick Hart recognized all too well. "I heard you're considering overruling a third strike conviction. Is that true?" His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. Hart chose his words carefully, aware of the weight each one carried in this unofficial trial. "I'm reviewing the legality and fairness of the case. There are serious concerns about how it was handled." "Legality and fairness," Ellison repeated, replacing his glasses with deliberate precision. His tone was quiet, but sharp as a well-honed blade. "The law is clear on 3 strikes. The precedent is established. The public expects consistency from this court." "With respect," Hart said, maintaining eye contact, "consistency shouldn't override justice. That was never the intention of the bench." Ellison's face hardened, lines deepening around his mouth. "If you rule against the statute, you'll be overruled or removed. You'll lose your pension, your name, your seat." He leaned forward slightly, invading Hart's space. "Is that what you want, William? To throw away decades of service for some misguided principle?" The threat hung in the air between them, almost tangible. Hart felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral, years of courtroom discipline serving him well. The evidence suggests serious irregularities in this case. I can't ignore that. Evidence can be interpreted many ways, Ellison said smoothly. He opened a drawer and withdrew a folder with practiced ease. Governor Matthews called this morning. He's very interested in maintaining our court's reputation for being tough on repeat offenders. He mentioned your name specifically. Hart watched as Ellison laid out more papers, each one a silent warning. The Citizens Justice Coalition is prepared to run a full-page ad supporting our 3 strikes policy. Channel 8 News has already requested comment on the case. He paused meaningfully. Senator Phillips specifically asked about you. He remembers supporting your appointment quite clearly. The implications were clear as crystal. Hart felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him. Politicians, donors, media figures, all waiting to see if he'd fall in line or need to be made an example of. And what about your family, William? Ellison's voice softened dangerously, like a snake before striking. Ethics investigations can be thorough. Every decision you've made, every connection, every family matter, all becomes public record. Claire's charity work, Isabel's college applications. He spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. It would be unfortunate to see them drawn into this mess you're creating. Hart's jaw tightened. The mention of his family sent a chill through him, but it also sparked something else. A slow, burning anger that warmed him against the cold calculation of Ellison's threats. Justice isn't supposed to be easy. You taught me that once. No, Ellison agreed with the faintest smile that never reached his eyes. But it is supposed to be consistent, predictable. That's what maintains order. He closed the folder with a decisive snap that echoed in the quiet room. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider your position. After that, he shrugged. Then prepare to be alone. Very alone. Hart stood slowly, his legs steady despite the trembling he felt inside. Is that all, Your Honor? His voice remained even, professional to the end. Ellison nodded once, already turning his attention to other papers on his desk. The dismissal was clear, another power play in their unspoken contest. Hart walked out of the chambers, his footsteps somehow louder than before on the polished floor. The case folder felt heavy in his hands, and his fingers gripped it tighter, as if it might slip away. The hallway stretched before him, empty and long, a path he would have to walk alone. If I bend now, I never stood for anything, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his footsteps on marble. The words were for himself alone, a reminder of what was truly at stake. The afternoon sun still streamed through the windows, but now it felt less warm, more exposed, a spotlight on a man at a crossroads. Hart continued walking, the weight of Ellison's threats pressing down on his shoulders, but his stride remained purposeful. The folder in his hands contained more than just papers. It held the truth he'd spent his career pursuing, and now, perhaps, the end of that career itself. But for the first time in years, he felt something like peace in the midst of the storm. The evening shadows stretched across Hart's home office as he settled into his worn leather chair. Legal volumes towered around him like ancient sentinels, their spines faded with age and use. His coffee steamed beside a stack of yellow legal pads covered in his precise handwriting. The weight of the day, his confrontation with Ellison, the memories stirred up by Marcus, pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible burden he couldn't shake. Hart pulled his laptop closer, the screen's glow illuminating his tired features, casting harsh shadows that deepened the lines around his eyes. He typed, "Prosecutorial misconduct, mandatory sentencing override," into the legal database search bar. His fingers moved mechanically, driven by decades of practice and determination that had become second nature. There has to be something, he muttered, scrolling through case after case, his frustration growing with each dead end. Each ruling seemed to reinforce the rigid nature of three strikes laws, offering no flexibility, no room for compassion. But Hart refused to give up. He'd seen too many lives destroyed by inflexible justice. His father's face flashed in his mind, followed by Jeremiah's gaunt features, haunting him with their silent plea. The clock ticked past 8, then 9, marking time as his search continued. Empty coffee cups multiplied on his desk like silent witnesses to his determination. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he kept searching, digging deeper into appellate decisions and judicial reviews, following threads of hope through the legal maze. Claire knocked once, leaving a sandwich that went untouched as his hunger for justice outweighed his physical needs. Then, buried in a footnote referencing another case, he saw it. Commonwealth versus Niles, 2007. His heart quickened as he pulled up the full text, a surge of adrenaline chasing away his fatigue. The ruling had been controversial at the time, a judge overriding a mandatory sentence due to prosecutorial misconduct. Hart leaned forward, reading intently, hardly daring to breathe. When the integrity of the judicial process itself is compromised through misconduct or materially flawed evidence, the court maintains inherent discretionary power to ensure justice is served, regardless of mandatory sentencing guidelines. Hart's hand shook slightly as he hit the print button, hope rising in his chest. The case wasn't exactly like Jeremiah's, but the principles aligned perfectly, creating a pathway where none had existed before. He grabbed a highlighter, marking key passages as they emerged from his printer. Yellow streaks emphasized phrases like fundamental fairness, judicial discretion, and evidence integrity, each mark bringing Jeremiah's freedom one step closer. On a fresh legal pad, he began constructing his timeline, his handwriting growing more confident with each line. At the top, he wrote, "Prosecution Evidence Timeline," in bold letters, pressing hard enough to leave an impression on the pages below. Under it, he listed each problematic element. Next to each point, he carefully noted relevant precedents and statutory violations, connecting dots that others had missed or ignored. The pattern was clear. This wasn't just about one piece of questionable evidence. It was about a systematic failure of justice that had robbed two young girls of their father. Hart pulled out another pad and began drafting his statement of findings, his mind now crystal clear despite the late hour. His pen moved quickly now, confidence growing with each paragraph. He connected the dots between Niles and the current case, building a legal framework for his decision. The words flowed easier than they had in years, fueled by conviction rather than obligation, by heart rather than habit. In light of Commonwealth versus Niles, 2007, he wrote, "This court finds that multiple irregularities in evidence handling and witness testimony have fundamentally compromised the integrity of these proceedings. When such irregularities exist, this court not only has the right but the duty to exercise judicial discretion in sentencing, regardless of statutory minimums." Around 11, he reached for his phone and typed out a text to Eli. "Need you here 7 a.m. sharp. Bringing coffee. Found our precedent." A small smile crossed his face as he sent the message, knowing his clerk would understand its significance. Hart rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. His gaze fell on a new addition to his desk, a framed photograph Cynthia had given him that afternoon. In it, Naomi and Nadine stood together, their arms linked, faces bright with hope despite everything. The photo caught them in a rare moment of childhood joy, before the weight of their father's situation had fully settled on their young shoulders. He picked up the frame, studying their faces in the dim light. Naomi's fierce, protective stance, Nadine's gentle smile. They reminded him of himself and Marcus at that age, before their own father was taken away. Before Hart had learned to hide behind law books and procedure instead of fighting for what was right. Their innocent faces seemed to look directly at him, asking silently for the justice they deserved. "Let's make this count," he said quietly to the empty room, his voice carrying the weight of both promise and prayer. The words hung in the air as he reached over and clicked off his desk lamp, leaving only the moon's soft light filtering through the window, casting long shadows across his workspace. Tomorrow would bring the hearing, but tonight, for the first time in years, Judge William Hart felt the full alignment of his legal duty and his moral compass. In the darkness of his office, surrounded by the tools of justice he'd wielded for so long, he finally understood what his brother had meant at the diner. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was becoming the kind of authority figure he and Marcus had needed all those years ago. Someone who stood for what was right, not just what was written. The house creaked quietly around him as he gathered his papers, organizing them carefully for morning. Outside, crickets chirped their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked briefly before fading into the night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment, Hart knew with absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. For Jeremiah, for Naomi and Nadine, and maybe, in some small way, for the boy he once was, waiting for a justice that never came. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment glinting in the early light. The air crackled with tension as two distinct groups of protesters faced off across the sidewalk, their signs bobbing like angry waves in an ocean of conflict. The scene resembled a battlefield more than a place of justice, with reporters darting between the groups like war correspondents. "Justice for Jeremiah," called one side, their homemade signs decorated with pictures of the Cole family. Some held candles despite the daylight, a silent vigil for what they saw as a broken system. "3 strikes means out," shouted the others, their professionally printed placards demanding strict adherence to the law. Their coordinated chants echoed off the courthouse's marble facade, drowning out individual voices in a chorus of righteous certainty. Through this charged atmosphere, Naomi and Nadine Cole made their way up the courthouse steps, flanked by Cynthia Morales. The twins wore matching navy blue dresses, their hair neatly braided, a touching attempt at courthouse propriety that made them look even younger than their 8 years. Naomi's chin was lifted high, though her hand trembled slightly as she gripped her sister's. Nadine kept her eyes down, watching her feet take each step as if the ground might disappear beneath her at any moment. "Don't look at them," Cynthia murmured, guiding the girls through the crowd with a protective arm around their shoulders. "Just keep walking. We're almost there." Her voice was steady, a lifeline in the storm of shouting and camera flashes. Minutes later, a police transport van pulled up to the side entrance. 2 officers emerged with Jeremiah Cole between them, his hands cuffed in front of him. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his thin frame, but his eyes were clear and alert as he caught sight of his daughters through the crowd. He couldn't wave, but he managed a small smile, one that both girls returned instantly, their faces lighting up despite the circumstances. That brief moment of connection seemed to strengthen all 3 of them visibly. Meanwhile, Judge William Hart slipped in through the courthouse's rear entrance, away from the media circus out front. The service corridor was quiet, its fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum as he made his way to his chambers, each step measured and deliberate. The weight of the day's decision hung heavy in the air around him. Eli was waiting by the door, a neat stack of papers clutched in his hands. The young clerk's usual energy was tempered by the gravity of the moment, his tie perfectly straight, his expression serious. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been up most of the night, just like Hart. "Morning, Your Honor," Eli said, following Hart into the chambers. He held out the stapled document, Hart's ruling, typed and formatted according to court standards. "I've proofed it twice. Everything's in order." His voice carried a note of reverence, understanding the document's significance. Hart took the papers, feeling their weight. Not just the physical weight, but the weight of what they represented. Years of precedent, careers, lives. He looked at his clerk, seeing the question in the young man's eyes. The unspoken words hung between them like a physical presence. "You sure about this, sir?" Hart didn't hesitate. He gave a single firm nod. The time for doubt was past. He reached for his judicial robe, the black fabric familiar in his hands. As he slipped it on, he felt the mantle of his office settling around him, not as a burden now, but as armor. The transformation was subtle but profound. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set with resolve. Taking a deep breath, Hart stepped into the courtroom. The reaction was immediate. A wave of whispers and gasps rippled through the gallery as he made his way to the bench. Camera shutters clicked rapidly from the approved media section, capturing what everyone sensed would be a historic moment. Lansing sat at the prosecution table, his jaw tight, fingers drumming silently on his legal pad. while Cynthia Morales straightened in her chair beside Jeremiah, hope and fear battling in her expression. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise." The Superior Court of the State is now in session, the Honorable Judge William Hart presiding. Once everyone was seated again, Hart surveyed the packed courtroom. His gaze passed over each face. Jeremiah, still dignified despite his chains. The twins, holding hands in the front row, their knuckles white with tension. Lansing, whose expression promised future battles, the reporters scribbling in their notepads, and the public gallery, filled with citizens who understood this was more than just another hearing. It was a moment of reckoning. "Before we proceed," Hart began, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the last whispers like a knife, "I want to establish the scope of today's hearing. We are here to examine two critical issues: the integrity of the evidence presented in this case and the legitimacy of the mandatory sentence as it applies under these circumstances." Lansing shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this court lacks jurisdiction to review a statutorily mandated sentence. The law is clear." "The law," Hart interrupted calmly, raising a hand to silence the prosecutor, "gives me that authority when justice is compromised. You'll have your chance to argue, Mr. Lansing, but this hearing will proceed." His tone left no room for debate. Hart turned his attention to the front row, where Naomi sat practically vibrating with tension, her sister pressed close to her side. "Ms. Cole," he addressed Naomi directly, his tone gentler, "I need your word that you and your sister will remain seated and quiet during these proceedings, regardless of what transpires. Can you do that?" Naomi's eyes met his, and in them he saw not just determination but understanding. She nodded firmly, squeezing Nadine's hand. The younger twin leaned into her sister's shoulder, their unity a silent testimony to everything at stake. A tear trembled on Nadine's lashes but didn't fall. The courtroom settled into an expectant hush. Outside, the chants of protesters drifted faintly through the windows like distant thunder. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, pens scratched against paper, and hearts beat with anticipation. A clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the moments before everything changed. Every eye in the room fixed on Hart as he opened the folder before him, the papers inside representing months of investigation, years of precedent, and a lifetime of wrestling with justice. "This court," Hart announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "will now render judgment." The morning sunlight filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting a solemn glow across the packed gallery. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, catching the light like tiny stars. Judge William Hart sat straight-backed at his bench, his black robe settling around him like armor. The polished wood beneath his hands felt cool and familiar. The rustling of papers and whispered conversations died down as he cleared his throat and opened the manila folder before him. "This court will now deliver its findings regarding the matter of People versus Jeremiah Cole," Hart began, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "After careful review of evidence and testimony, several irregularities have come to light that demand immediate attention." He adjusted his reading glasses and lifted the first page, the paper crisp between his fingers. "First, we address the matter of surveillance footage from the convenience store. Technical analysis has confirmed that approximately 6 minutes of video were manually removed from the recording after its initial upload. The access logs, which have been entered into evidence, show this modification was made by law enforcement personnel after Mr. Cole's arrest." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like wind through tall grass. Several spectators leaned forward in their seats. Lansing shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his manicured fingers drumming silently on the table. "Second," Hart continued, his tone measured and deliberate, "this court has discovered significant issues with the testimony of prosecution witness Darren Bowles." He lifted another document, holding it firmly. "Employment records show Mr. Bowles was terminated from the convenience store 8 months prior to the incident in question. His testimony about witnessing Mr. Cole's alleged pattern of theft was, therefore, impossible and constitutes perjury." Naomi squeezed Nadine's hand tighter, their fingers interlaced and trembling. Tears glistened in both their eyes as they watched their father, who sat perfectly still, his shoulders straight despite his shackles, his weathered face a mask of quiet dignity. Furthermore, Hart's voice grew stronger, filling the chamber with authority. Mr. Bowles has a documented history of filing false police reports and was subject to disciplinary action for discriminatory conduct during his employment. This calls into serious question the credibility of his entire testimony. Your Honor, Lansing suddenly stood, his face flushed red to the roots of his perfectly combed hair. I must object. This is a dangerous overreach of judicial authority. The three strikes law leaves no room for... Hart's gavel cracked once, sharp and decisive, the sound ricocheting off the marble walls. Mr. Lansing, you will remain seated. And let the record reflect that what's truly dangerous is ignoring truth in the name of convenience. Lansing sank back into his chair, lips pressed into a thin line, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. Third, Hart continued, lifting another document with careful precision. This court has reviewed Mr. Cole's prior convictions. In each instance, the record shows theft of basic necessities, food, and medicine. These are not the actions of a career criminal seeking profit, but of a father desperate to provide for his children. Hart paused, removing his glasses to look directly at Jeremiah. The fluorescent lights caught the silver at his temples, highlighting decades of experience etched in his face. The former teacher met his gaze steadily, dignity evident in his bearing despite months of imprisonment. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a shared understanding of justice and mercy. The court recognizes Ms. Morales for a final statement, Hart announced, his voice carrying a note of anticipation. Cynthia rose slowly from her chair, smoothing her navy blazer. Her voice rang clear and passionate through the hushed chamber. Your Honor, Jeremiah Cole is not a threat to society. He's a father who fell through the cracks of our system. A man who, when faced with impossible choices, chose his children's survival over his own freedom. Justice without mercy isn't justice at all. Cameras clicked softly as reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads, their pens scratching against paper like whispered prayers. One journalist underlined the phrase, "Judge challenges 3 strikes head-on twice," his pen pressing hard enough to leave indentations on the pages below. Hart nodded to Cynthia, acknowledging her words with quiet respect, and lifted his written decision. The pages rustled like autumn leaves in his hands. This court finds that multiple irregularities have compromised the integrity of both evidence and testimony. Furthermore, citing Commonwealth v. Niles, when prosecutorial misconduct or flawed evidence threatens the fundamental fairness of a trial, this court has not just the authority but the obligation to act. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with each word, thick enough to touch. Naomi and Nadine leaned forward, barely breathing, their shoulders pressed together for support. Jeremiah closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, his expression carefully controlled, though hope flickered in their depths. Hart's voice filled the chamber with quiet authority, each word weighted with purpose. The law exists to serve justice, not to prevent it. When we allow rigid adherence to override clear evidence of misconduct, we betray the very principles we claim to uphold. He set down his papers and gripped the gavel. His hand trembled slightly, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the moment, the gravity of what was to come. His eyes moved from Jeremiah to his daughters, taking in their hopeful faces, their clasped hands, their quiet strength. In their expressions, he saw echoes of his own past, of choices made and paths not taken. Drawing a deep breath that seemed to pull all the air from the room, Hart raised the gavel high. Sunlight glinted off its polished head like a beacon of hope. The sound of its descent seemed to echo through the hushed courtroom like thunder, a moment suspended between what was and what could be. The court finds that the conviction must be overturned. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the courtroom exploded into chaos. The sudden surge of noise hit like a wave. Gasps of shock, cries of joy, and scattered applause all crashing together in a deafening rush. Some people jumped to their feet while others sat frozen in disbelief, their mouths hanging open in stunned silence. Michael Lansing's face drained of color. His hands gripped the prosecution table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Your Honor," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "This is completely unprecedented." But his words were swallowed by the growing commotion, disappearing into the storm of emotion that swept through the room. Judge Hart remained still and steady on the bench, watching the scene unfold before him. His decision hung in the air like thunder after lightning, and he could feel its power rippling through the room. He made no move to silence the eruption of emotion. Some moments deserved to be felt in their fullness. This was one of them. In the gallery, reporters scrambled over each other, some rushing for the doors with phones pressed to their ears, others furiously scribbling notes. Camera flashes sparked like lightning across the room. The bailiffs moved uncertainly, looking to Hart for direction, but he gave a subtle shake of his head. Let them have this moment. Let justice breathe in its raw, unfiltered form. Cynthia Morales was already in motion, her hand gentle but urgent on Naomi's shoulder. "Go," she whispered, her own eyes bright with tears that threatened to spill over. "Go to him. He needs you now." Naomi grabbed Nadine's hand, and together they vaulted past the barrier. Their feet barely seemed to touch the ground as they ran to their father. Jeremiah, still processing the reality of his freedom, saw them coming and fell to his knees. His legs couldn't hold him up against the wave of emotion that crashed through his body, washing away years of pain in an instant. The twins slammed into him with such force it nearly knocked him backward. His arms wrapped around them both, pulling them close as great heaving sobs shook his entire frame. "I'm here," he choked out, his voice raw and broken with love. "I got you. I'm here." He buried his face in their hair, breathing them in, holding them like he'd never let go again, as if they might disappear if his grip loosened even slightly. Nadine couldn't speak through her tears, but her fingers clutched desperately at her father's prison jumpsuit. Naomi kept whispering, "Daddy," over and over, as if saying it enough times would make sure he stayed real, stayed free, stayed with them forever this time. Lansing surged to his feet again, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, I demand an immediate stay of this ruling pending appeal." His voice cut through the noise like a knife, sharp with indignation and wounded pride. Hart's response was quiet but carried absolute authority. "You may appeal, Mr. Lansing. That is your right." He paused, his eyes never leaving the embracing family. "But today, this man walks free." The words settled in the air with finality, unmovable as mountains. The bailiff moved forward, keys jingling in his hand. He knelt beside Jeremiah, who reluctantly loosened one arm from his daughter's so his shackles could be removed. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire chamber. The heavy metal fell away from Jeremiah's wrists, clattering against the floor in a moment of perfect poetry. That sound, that simple, beautiful sound of chains falling away, brought fresh tears to Hart's eyes. He didn't try to hide them as they rolled down his cheeks, though his posture remained composed and dignified on the bench. His hands, which had gripped the gavel so tightly moments before, now rested loosely in his lap, the tension finally draining from his fingers. The chaos in the courtroom continued to swirl, reporters pushing toward the doors, spectators talking excitedly, bailiffs trying to maintain some semblance of order. But around the Cole family, a small bubble of peace had formed. They remained on their knees, wrapped in each other's arms, their world narrowed to just the three of them and the miracle of being together again, healing beginning with each shared breath. Hart watched them, and gradually, the noise of the room seemed to fade away in his mind. The shouts and movement blurred into a distant hum. His eyes drifted to the now empty defendant's chair where Jeremiah had sat just minutes ago, weighted down by chains and the expectation of a life sentence. The empty space seemed to pulse with significance. A void where injustice had sat, now filled with hope and possibility. And there, on the bench, William Hart felt something shift inside him. The burden he'd carried for so many years, the weight of his father's case, the armor he'd built around his heart, it all began to lift. For the first time in decades, he felt weightless, as if he too had been freed from invisible chains that had bound him for far too long. The heavy wooden door of his chambers clicked shut behind Judge William Hart. His black robe hung slightly crooked on his shoulders, the weight of it suddenly more noticeable than ever before. The morning's events had left him emotionally drained, yet his mind remained sharp and focused. He made his way to his desk, the familiar leather chair creaking as he settled into it, the worn cushion molding to his frame like an old friend. His computer screen glowed with notifications. The inbox counter showed an alarming number: 147 new messages in just the past hour, media requests from every major network, hurriedly written legal opinions from colleagues across the state, and a flood of internal court emails marked urgent filled the screen. Hart rubbed his temples, the tension building behind his eyes like a gathering storm. The afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his desk that resembled prison bars. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each passing moment of this historic day with solemn precision. Hart reached for his reading glasses, but before he could begin sorting through the digital avalanche, his office door burst open with a bang that made the walls shudder and the framed law degree on the wall tilt slightly. Chief Judge Robert Ellison stormed in, his face flushed red with anger. He didn't bother closing the door behind him, letting it slam against the wall. "Do you understand what you've done?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. Hart remained seated, his posture straight but relaxed. He met Ellison's fierce gaze with steady eyes, saying nothing, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the hurricane that had just entered his chambers. "This isn't just about one case anymore, William," Ellison continued, pacing the office like a caged animal. "You've undermined the entire system. Every mandatory sentence in this jurisdiction is now vulnerable to challenge. Every single one." Spittle flew from his mouth as he emphasized each word. Before Hart could respond, Michael Lansing appeared in the doorway, his normally pristine suit wrinkled from the morning's tension. He stepped into the office uninvited, closing the door with controlled precision that somehow felt more threatening than Ellison's slam. His calculating eyes scanned the room, taking in the situation with cold efficiency. "The governor's office is already calling," Lansing said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "The press is having a field day. Judge defies law to free father. Mandatory sentencing under attack. This is exactly what we warned you about." His words carried the weight of betrayal, as if Hart had personally wounded him. Hart folded his hands on his desk, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light and sending a small rainbow dancing across his papers. "You had your chance to serve justice," he said quietly, looking directly at Lansing. "I took mine." Ellison slapped his palm against the wall. "Justice? You call this justice? This is judicial activism of the worst kind. You've opened the floodgates, William. Every defense attorney in the state will cite your ruling. Every convict with a sad story will demand a review." "Maybe they should," Hart replied, his voice remaining steady as a lighthouse in a storm. "Maybe that's exactly what we need." Lansing stepped closer to the desk, his shadow falling across Hart's papers like an ominous cloud. "I'm demanding an emergency review of your ruling. The precedent you cited was thin at best, and your interpretation of prosecutorial misconduct is extremely generous." His words were clipped, each one delivered like a precise surgical cut. "The evidence tampering was real," Hart said. "The perjured testimony was real. A man's life was at stake." The simplicity of his statement hung in the air, undeniable in its truth. "And your career?" Ellison cut in. "What about that?" "The ethics committee is already drafting a formal complaint. This could end everything you've built." His voice softened slightly, revealing a hint of genuine concern beneath the anger. Hart didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached down and pulled open his bottom desk drawer. The sound of wood sliding against wood filled the tense silence, like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. He removed a plain manila envelope, unmarked except for a small paperclip in the corner, and placed it carefully on the desk's polished surface. With deliberate slowness, he slid the envelope across to Ellison. "I'm not afraid to leave, Robert," he said softly, but with unmistakable conviction. "But I'm not sorry." His eyes held a peace that neither man in the room could understand. Ellison picked up the envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Hart's resignation letter, pristine and unsigned, waiting like a loaded gun. The message was clear. Hart had prepared for this moment. He'd weighed the consequences and made his choice with full awareness of the price he might have to pay. The letter represented both surrender and defiance all at once. Lansing's face twisted with disgust, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like angry drumbeats. Ellison remained, clutching the envelope, staring at Hart with a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect, or perhaps even envy. After a long moment, Ellison placed the envelope back on the desk. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. With a final glare, he turned and followed Lansing out, leaving the door ajar behind him. Hart sat alone in his chambers, the sudden silence broken only by his deep, measured breathing and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. His eyes drifted to the empty judge's chair that sat across the room, the chair where countless witnesses had testified, where lives had been changed by the words spoken from it. The dark leather seemed to absorb the afternoon light, and for the first time, it didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like something he had borrowed, something he had used to do what needed to be done, and perhaps, finally, something he had honored in the way it deserved. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Hart's home office, painting golden stripes across his mahogany desk. 2 documents lay before him, each carrying the weight of years of service and the promise of change. The first, his resignation letter, was typed on official court letterhead, crisp, formal, and waiting for his signature. The second, a public statement calling for reform of the 3 strikes law, remained a work in progress, its cursor blinking steadily on the screen of his laptop. The weight of these documents felt almost physical, like stones pressing against his chest. Hart heard soft footsteps approaching. Claire entered carrying a steaming mug of chamomile tea, her favorite remedy for difficult moments. She placed it beside him without a word and settled into the leather chair next to his desk. The familiar scent of honey and herbs filled the air between them, bringing with it memories of countless late nights and important decisions shared over similar cups. "Thank you," Hart said quietly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His wedding ring caught the fading sunlight, a gentle reminder of the promises they'd made to support each other through moments exactly like this one. Claire simply nodded, understanding his need for both support and space. She'd always known when to push and when to simply be present. Tonight was a night for presence. Her steady breathing matched the rhythm of the blinking cursor. Hart began typing slowly, deliberately choosing each word. The faces of those affected by his decision flashed through his mind. Jeremiah Cole, gaunt but standing tall as his shackles were removed. Naomi and Nadine, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced their father. Marcus, across the diner table, reminding him of their shared pain. Each memory strengthened his resolve. "The 3 strikes law," he typed, "was created with the intention of protecting our communities. But in its rigid application, we have forgotten that justice requires wisdom, not just rules." His fingers trembled slightly as he typed, but his conviction remained steady. He paused, taking a sip of tea. The warmth spread through his chest as memories of his own father's sentencing rose unbidden. The sound of the gavel, the cold fluorescent lights, the feeling of helplessness. His brother's words echoed in his mind. "Be the one we needed." The tea's sweetness couldn't quite mask the bitter taste of those memories. Hart's fingers moved with renewed purpose across the keys, the soft clicking filling the quiet room. "I have witnessed firsthand how this law, while well-intentioned, can become an instrument of injustice when wielded without discretion. We cannot allow legal procedure to blind us to human dignity. Each case brings before us not just a defendant but a person, someone's father, mother, brother, sister, someone's child." Claire leaned forward slightly, reading as he wrote. Her presence gave him strength as he continued. her silent support as vital as oxygen. The case of Jeremiah Cole has demonstrated that our system requires not just reformation, but transformation. When a man steals food to feed his children and faces life imprisonment for it, we must ask ourselves, are we serving justice or are we serving a system that has lost its way? The words flowed more freely now, powered by decades of suppressed conviction. Each sentence felt like breaking free from chains he hadn't known he wore. As judges, we take an oath to uphold the law, but we also bear a sacred responsibility to ensure that justice is served. When these two obligations conflict, we must have the courage to examine our conscience and act accordingly. Hart paused again, considering his next words carefully. The setting sun had faded to dusk, and Claire quietly stood to turn on his desk lamp. The warm light illuminated the resignation letter waiting beside his laptop, casting soft shadows across the embossed court seal. He typed the final paragraphs with unwavering certainty, each word feeling more right than the last. I call upon my colleagues in the judiciary, our legislators, and our community to re-examine the three strikes law. We need reform that allows for judicial discretion, that considers context and circumstance, that remembers our shared humanity. Justice must see the person, not just the law. Hart sat back, exhaling slowly. Claire squeezed his shoulder gently as she read the finished statement. Her touch carried decades of shared understanding. "It's perfect," she said softly, then leaned down to kiss his forehead. "I'm proud of you, Will." Her voice held the same warmth it had when he'd first told her about his dream of becoming a judge all those years ago. He reached for the resignation letter, picking up his pen. The signature took only a moment, a swift, decisive stroke that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He saved both documents, scheduled an email to the court administrator for the following morning, and sent the reform statement to several carefully chosen journalists, including Sandra Chen, a progressive legal columnist who had been following the Cole case closely. Each click of the mouse felt like setting down another burden. The house had grown quiet as evening settled in. Hart closed his laptop and stood, feeling lighter than he had in years. Claire took his hand, leading him toward the kitchen where Isabel was setting the table for dinner. The familiar domestic sounds, plates clinking, water running, chairs scraping across the floor, felt like music after days of legal chaos. The aroma of garlic and herbs wafted through the air, grounding him in this moment of transition. As Hart took his seat at the table, Isabel paused in serving the pasta she'd helped prepare. Her dark hair caught the kitchen light, reminding him suddenly of how quickly she was growing up. "Dad?" she asked, her young face serious. "Are you not a judge anymore?" Hart looked at his daughter, then at Claire, and smiled. "Not the kind with a gavel," he replied. The words felt like truth itself. They settled into their meal together, passing bread and sharing simple conversation. The weight of the day's decisions rested easily on Hart's shoulders as he sat with his family, finally present in both body and spirit, sharing a peaceful dinner in the growing twilight. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt completely at home in his own skin. The late afternoon sun filtered through thin curtains, casting warm shadows across the modest apartment's living room. Jeremiah Cole sat on a well-worn couch, his daughters pressed close against him on either side. The second-hand furniture didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together, finally home after so many months apart. The weight of his daughters against him felt like an anchor, grounding him in this new reality. Boxes lined the walls, some still sealed, others half-emptied with contents spread across the carpet. A stack of framed photos waited to be hung, memories ready to mark this space as theirs. The apartment wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms with faded paint and creaky floors, but to the Cole family, it was everything. It represented freedom and a second chance. Naomi reached into a nearby box and pulled out a familiar blanket, one that still carried the scent of their old house. "Remember this, Dad?" she asked, her voice soft with memory, her fingers tracing the patchwork pattern. Jeremiah ran his fingers over the worn fabric. "Your mother made this," he said, his voice catching slightly. "She started it when you girls were still growing inside her. She worked on it every evening, humming those old songs she loved." Nadine pressed closer to her father's side, seeking the comfort she'd missed for so long. The apartment might be unfamiliar, but her father's presence made it feel safe. Through the kitchen window, she could see the neighborhood children playing, their laughter drifting up to their second-floor unit. She watched them silently, wondering if she might join them someday. The refrigerator hummed contentedly, fully stocked for the first time in what felt like forever. Earlier that day, they'd gone grocery shopping together, filling the cart with fresh vegetables, fruits, and all the ingredients needed for proper meals. No more wondering where the next meal would come from, no more institutional food that never quite satisfied. As evening approached, Jeremiah stood up, stretching his tall frame. "Time to start dinner," he announced, moving toward the kitchen with purpose. The girls followed, eager to help, to be part of this normal moment they'd dreamed about for so long. The simple act of preparing a meal together felt sacred. "Can I help stir?" Nadine asked, her usual shyness giving way to excitement. She bounced slightly on her toes, a rare display of childlike enthusiasm. "Of course, sweetheart," Jeremiah smiled, pulling out pots and pans. "Naomi, would you set the table? There should be enough plates in that box over there." Naomi grabbed plates from a box marked "Kitchen" in neat black marker. As she arranged them on their small dining table, she and Nadine started a playful argument about who would say grace. "I said it last night," Nadine protested, giggling as she stirred the sauce with careful concentration. "But you're better at it," Naomi countered, arranging the silverware just so, making sure everything was perfect for their first real dinner at home. Jeremiah watched them from the stove, his heart full. After everything they'd been through, hearing them laugh felt like a miracle. He stirred the pot of pasta, adding seasoning with careful consideration. "Girls," he said during a lull in their banter, "I've got some news. I have a job interview at the school board next week." Both girls turned to him, eyes wide with hope. "Really?" Naomi asked, while Nadine clapped her hands together, nearly dropping the wooden spoon. "Really," he confirmed. "It's not teaching yet, but it's a start. Administrative work in the education department. Mr. Thornton from the community center helped set it up." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Sarah, a volunteer from the local charity that had helped them secure the apartment. She carried 2 bulging bags, her kind face flushed from climbing the stairs. "School supplies," she announced cheerfully, setting them down. "And some clothes, too. Everything you'll need for next semester. There are a few books in there as well. I remembered you liked reading, Nadine." The girls rushed to peek inside the bags while Jeremiah thanked Sarah quietly. "We wouldn't be here without your organization's help," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." After Sarah left, Nadine stood by the window, clutching a new notebook to her chest. Her voice was small when she spoke. "Dad? We're never going back to a foster home, right?" The question trembled in the air between them. The question hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt before his daughter. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes so much like her mother's. "No, sweetheart, never. We're together now, for good, I promise you that." Naomi joined them, wrapping her arms around both her father and sister. They stayed that way for a long moment, holding each other, healing. Their embrace was tight, as if each was afraid the others might disappear if they let go. Later, as Jeremiah finished preparing dinner, the girls disappeared into their shared bedroom. They returned with a piece of paper held between them, proud grins on their faces, whispering and giggling. "We made this for you," Naomi announced, presenting the drawing with flourish. "Our first family project." Jeremiah carefully took the paper. 3 stick figures stood hand in hand, surrounded by hearts and what appeared to be a house. Above it all, in careful block letters, was written, "Home." Each figure was labeled Dad, Naomi, and Nadine, with smiles drawn on their round faces. His vision blurred with tears as he studied every detail. "It's beautiful," he managed to say. "This is going right on the fridge." He secured it with a magnet they'd found in one of the boxes, placing it at eye level where he'd see it every day. They ate dinner together, saying grace. Nadine won the friendly argument, sharing stories and making plans for the future. Simple plans: what color to paint the walls, where to put the bookshelf, when to start looking at schools nearby. Normal plans. Family plans. The kind of everyday conversation that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. When dinner was done and the dishes were cleaned, Jeremiah led his daughters to their bedroom. 2 twin beds waited, made up with fresh sheets donated by the charity. He tucked them in, just as he used to do years ago before everything fell apart. The familiar ritual felt both strange and wonderfully right. Naomi caught his hand as he smoothed her blanket. "We knew you'd come back," she whispered, her eyes heavy with sleep, but bright with love. "We never stopped believing." Jeremiah leaned down and kissed first her forehead, then Nadine's. He paused in the doorway, watching their breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep. His daughters, his heart, his reason for everything. The sight of them safe in their beds was worth every hardship he'd endured. Quietly, he made his way back to the living room. The evening light had faded to purple dusk outside the windows. He sank down onto the couch, surrounded by the boxes of their new life waiting to be unpacked. For the first time in years, a genuine smile spread across his face. Not forced, not worried, but peaceful. Finally, truly peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight his family was whole again. The afternoon light streamed through Hart's kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the granite countertops. He sat at the breakfast nook, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, his laptop open before him. The screen displayed various news articles, their headlines bold and attention-grabbing, his eyes fixed on one in particular. Judge resigns after courageous ruling. Community reacts. Hart took a slow sip of coffee, scrolling through the comments section. Some praised his decision as brave and necessary, while others criticized him for judicial activism. He'd stopped caring about the criticism days ago. The image of Jeremiah embracing his daughters in that courtroom had made it all worthwhile. Claire had left sticky notes on the fridge with encouraging messages. "Proud of you," one read in her neat handwriting. Another simply said, "Hero." He smiled and shook his head. He didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had finally chosen to do what was right instead of what was expected. His phone buzzed on the counter, displaying an unknown number. Hart hesitated for a moment before answering. "William Hart speaking," he said, his judicial formality still intact despite no longer wearing the robe. "Judge Hart," a warm, professional voice responded. "This is Angela Foster, Director of the National Civil Rights Reform Initiative. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Hart straightened in his chair. He knew the organization well. They were one of the leading voices for criminal justice reform in the country. "Not at all, Ms. Foster. What can I do for you? First, I want to thank you for your courage in the Cole case. What you did, it's exactly the kind of principled stand we need more of in our justice system." Hart nodded silently, waiting for her to continue. "I'll get straight to the point," Angela said. "We'd like you to join us as a senior advisor on criminal justice reform. Your experience, your understanding of the system from the inside, and now your demonstrated commitment to reform. It's a powerful combination." Hart's coffee grew cold as Angela outlined the role. She spoke of public speaking engagements, testimony before state legislatures, consulting on draft legislation for sentencing reform. It was a chance to turn one moment of courage into lasting change. "I'm honored," Hart said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm comfortable being in the spotlight. What I did was about justice, not about me." Angela's laugh was gentle but firm. "With respect, Judge Hart, you're already the face of the change we need. Your story resonates because it shows that even those deep within the system can choose to stand up for what's right. We need that voice, your voice." Hart glanced at his resignation letter, framed on the wall. He'd written it expecting an end, but maybe it was just the beginning. "Can I take some time to think about it?" he asked. "Of course, take the weekend. But remember, every day we wait is another day someone sits in a cell because of laws we know need to change." After hanging up, Hart walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood he'd called home for decades. The same streets, the same houses, but everything felt different now. His phone rang again, this time a familiar number, Marcus. "Hey, big brother." Marcus's voice carried its usual gruff warmth. "You're famous now, huh? Saw you on the morning news?" Hart couldn't help but smile. "Don't start." "No, really. My mechanic customers keep asking if I'm related to that judge. I tell them you got all the brains, I got all the looks." Hart laughed, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. "I'd rather be useful than famous." "Yeah, well, looks like you might get to be both," Marcus said. "You thinking about taking that civil rights job? News travels fast." Hart sighed. "How did you—" "Small city, big gossip. Plus, I might have heard from Claire." "Of course you did." Hart moved back to his desk, sitting down heavily. "I don't know, Marcus. It's a big step." "Bigger than giving up your judgeship?" "Different kind of big. More public." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Remember what Dad used to say? If you see something wrong and have the power to fix it, staying quiet is the same as breaking it yourself." Hart closed his eyes. Their father's words hit home as they always did. After saying goodbye to Marcus, Hart sat at his computer. He opened a new document and typed a title: Proposals for Restorative Justice Reform. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing, slower than his usual pace but with a sense of purpose that made every word count. The cursor blinked steadily as Hart began to shape his thoughts into action. The afternoon light shifted, shadows lengthening across the kitchen floor, but he barely noticed. For the first time since removing his robes, he felt the weight of his new role settling onto his shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility he was finally ready to bear. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of courtroom 4B, casting long shadows across the empty gallery benches. Judge William Hart stood in the doorway, his hand lingering on the heavy wooden door as it slowly closed behind him. The familiar scent of polish and old wood filled his nostrils, bringing with it a flood of memories from his years on the bench, moments of triumph and regret, justice served and sometimes missed. The courtroom felt different now, smaller perhaps, or just quieter without the usual bustle of attorneys, defendants, and spectators. His footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor as he walked down the center aisle, each step deliberate and measured. The American flag hung motionless in the corner, its stars and stripes frozen in the still air, a silent witness to the thousands of lives that had been altered within these walls. Hart paused at the gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. How many times had he watched people pass through this barrier? Some walking toward freedom, others toward confinement. His fingers traced the smooth wooden rail, worn from decades of nervous hands, before he pushed it open with a familiar creak that seemed louder in the empty room. The judge's bench loomed before him, its elevated position designed to command respect and authority. A thin layer of dust had settled on its surface, just a week's worth, but enough to make the change tangible. Hart climbed the 3 steps slowly, each one bringing back vivid memories. Naomi's tear-streaked face as she pleaded for her father, Jeremiah's gaunt features as he stood for sentencing, the weight of the gavel in his hand as he made his final ruling, a ruling that had changed everything. "Please don't send our daddy away." Naomi's words echoed in his mind, clear as the day she'd spoken them, cutting through his carefully constructed armor of legal detachment. Hart reached out and ran his hand along the polished wood of the bench. This seat had once represented something immovable to him, the rigid letter of the law, unyielding and absolute. Now he saw it differently, not as a throne of judgment, but as a position of responsibility, where compassion and justice could work together to truly serve people, not just sentences. The morning light caught dust motes dancing in the air as Hart reached into his briefcase. He withdrew a cream-colored envelope marked in his neat handwriting, "For my successor." Inside, he'd tucked a personal note along with a printed copy of his public statement on judicial reform. His legacy, he hoped, more meaningful than all his years of strict adherence to precedent. He placed it carefully in the center of the desk, positioning it where it couldn't be missed. His eyes swept across the courtroom one final time. The empty jury box where 12 citizens had sat in judgment, the witness stand where Darren Bowles had given his false testimony that nearly destroyed a family, The defense table where Cynthia Morales had fought so passionately for her client, against seemingly impossible odds. The gallery where two young girls had watched their world hang in the balance, their faces etched forever in his memory. Hart's fingers moved to the buttons of his black robe, the garment he'd worn like armor for so many years. He slipped it off his shoulders, feeling lighter with each movement, as though shedding more than just cloth. The heavy fabric held the weight of countless decisions, both right and wrong. He folded it with precise movements, creating neat creases that would hold long after he left, a habit from a lifetime of order and control. Standing at the bench one last time, Hart looked out over the empty courtroom. From this vantage point, he'd seen thousands of faces, the hopeful, the desperate, the angry, the resigned. He'd delivered verdicts that changed lives forever. But none had changed him quite like his final ruling, when he'd finally chosen to see the person before the precedent. The robe settled onto the bench with a soft whisper of fabric. Hart straightened it one last time, then stepped back. His shoes clicked against the steps as he descended, each sound marking another step away from his old life and toward something uncertain, but somehow more honest. At the doorway, he paused. The morning sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the room. The bench stood empty, waiting for its next occupant. Hart's hand found the door handle, cool and familiar under his palm. He took one final look at the chamber where he'd spent so many years, where he'd finally found the courage to choose justice over tradition, mercy over rigidity. Then he stepped out into the sunlight, letting the heavy doors swing closed behind him, walking toward a future where he could finally face himself in the mirror. The autumn morning painted the elementary school playground in shades of gold and amber. Children's laughter filled the crisp air as they chased each other across the blacktop, their backpacks bouncing with each step. Jeremiah Cole walked between his daughters, his pressed khaki pants and light blue button-down shirt a far cry from the prison uniform he'd worn just months ago. His shoes, though slightly scuffed, were polished to a shine. He'd spent extra time on them this morning, wanting everything to be perfect for this important day. "Daddy, are you nervous about tutoring later?" Naomi asked, squeezing his hand. Her ponytail swung back and forth as she walked, catching the morning sunlight with each bounce. Jeremiah smiled down at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "A little, but good nervous. Like butterflies before something exciting." "Like the butterflies I get before a spelling test?" Nadine chimed in from his other side, her voice soft but steady. She looked up at him with those trusting eyes that still amazed him every day. "Exactly like that, sweetheart." He gave both their hands a gentle squeeze as they approached the school's main entrance. The weight of their small hands in his felt like a miracle he'd never take for granted again. Inside, the hallways buzzed with activity. Teachers herded students toward the auditorium, their voices rising above the general chaos of an elementary school morning. Colorful artwork lined the walls. Fall trees made of construction paper and tissue paper, their leaves scattered across bulletin boards. The smell of school supplies and floor cleaner brought back memories of his teaching days. "Remember where to meet me after school?" Jeremiah asked as they joined the flow of students heading to assembly. He knelt down briefly to straighten Nadine's slightly crooked collar. "At the library," both girls answered in unison, making him chuckle. The sound of his own laughter still surprised him sometimes. How natural it felt now. The auditorium was filling quickly. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the wooden stage gleamed under the spotlight. Naomi and Nadine found seats in the front row with their classmates while Jeremiah stood at the back, leaning against the wall with other parents who'd stayed to watch. A few nodded politely in his direction, small gestures that meant the world to him. The principal, Mrs. Martinez, approached the podium. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers. "Good morning, everyone. Today we have a very special guest speaker. He's someone who reminds us why justice matters and how important it is to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." The spotlight shifted and William Hart walked onto the stage. He wore no judge's robe, no formal suit, just clean slacks and a simple sweater that made him look more like a grandfather than the formidable judge Jeremiah had first met. His silver hair caught the light as he moved to center stage, and though his shoulders weren't draped in judicial authority anymore, He carried himself with the same quiet dignity. In the front row, Naomi grabbed Nadine's hand. Their eyes widened with recognition, and matching smiles spread across their faces. They bounced slightly in their seats, unable to contain their excitement. Hart adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of young faces. "Good morning," he began, his voice warm and genuine. "I'm here to talk to you about something very important, the difference between what's legal and what's right." He paced slowly across the stage as he spoke, his hands moving expressively. Sometimes in life, we face choices that seem impossible. Sometimes the rules don't match up with what our hearts tell us is fair. Those are the moments that test who we really are. The children sat surprisingly still, caught up in his words. Even the usual whispers and fidgeting had quieted. A paper airplane that had been ready for launch remained folded in a little boy's hand, forgotten. "I used to think being strong meant never changing your mind," Hart continued. "I thought rules were rules and that was that. But then I met two very brave girls who taught me something important." His eyes found Naomi and Nadine in the front row. "They taught me that real strength is having the courage to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" Naomi beamed up at him while Nadine ducked her head shyly, but both girls glowed with pride. From the back of the room, Jeremiah felt his throat tighten with emotion. Hart shared stories about justice and fairness, carefully adapted for young ears. He talked about standing up to bullies, about speaking truth even when it's scary, about helping others even when it's hard. The children leaned forward in their seats, completely engaged, hanging on his every word. As his talk wound down, Hart's voice grew softer, more personal. "Every single one of you has the power to change someone's life for the better. Sometimes all it takes is being brave enough to speak up when you see something wrong." When the assembly ended and children began filing out, Naomi and Nadine couldn't contain themselves any longer. They broke away from their class line and ran straight for the stage. Hart knelt down just in time to catch them both in a tight hug, his formal demeanor melting away completely. "You saved our daddy," Nadine whispered against his shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. Her small fingers clutched at his sweater. Hart held them close, his own eyes growing misty. These weren't just two students anymore. They were the spark that had reignited his belief in true justice. They had changed him as much as he had changed their lives. Jeremiah made his way through the thinning crowd, stopping a few feet away. He stood straight and tall, nothing like the broken man who had once stood before Hart's bench. When Hart stood up, Jeremiah extended his hand, steady and sure. "I never got to thank you," Jeremiah said, his voice steady but full of feeling. "So, thank you." The simple words carried the weight of months of freedom, of bedtime stories and breakfast tables, of a life reclaimed. Hart clasped his hand firmly. "You did everything right," he replied with a gentle smile. "You just needed someone to see it." They stood there for a moment, two men forever connected by a choice that had changed both their lives. Through the auditorium windows, the morning sun had risen fully, bathing the room in warm light. Naomi and Nadine stood between them, no longer afraid, no longer alone. As they parted ways, the girls heading to class, Jeremiah to his tutoring job, and Hart to his next speaking engagement, the sunlight streamed through the windows, touching everything with gold. It wasn't just another morning. It was proof that sometimes justice wore no robe, that courage had many faces, and that doing what was right could break even the strongest chains. If you enjoyed the story of William, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Break even the strongest chains. If you enjoyed the story of William, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.